My name is Jackson Daly, and I'm an intern with the East Texas War Memory Project. On behalf of my fellow interns, thank you for joining us for our fourth presentation of the War Memory Lecture Series and our first one of the spring semester. Today, we are proud to host U.S. Army veteran and native German, Karl Klaus. Mr. Klaus's childhood was spent in the heat of World War II in Germany, but his family eventually immigrated to the U.S. in 1957. After getting his high school diploma, he enlisted into the Army in 1959, eventually attaining the rank of Specialist 4. Stationed in Stuttgart, Germany, during his service, Mr. Klaus served as a liaison with German forces just as the Soviets built the Berlin Wall. After his service, he earned 2 degrees and worked for Atlantic Richfield Company, the company responsible for the technology used in the swimming competitions in the Munich Olympics in 1972. Mr. Klaus was joined on stage by our moderator, Nick Springer, a senior history and math double major and fellow intern in the project. Following the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. Please use the index cards given to you upon entry to write questions you wish to ask Mr. Klaus, and then pass them to the end of the aisle where the baskets are located. We'll do our best to get all questions answered. Again, thank you for coming, and now we'll turn it over to Nick and Mr. Klaus.
First question is, what do you remember about your childhood in Germany?
Well, first of all, before I say anything, I would like to thank Dr. Kruger and his team for the opportunity. I think this is a great project, and I will be 74 next month, and now that somebody might remember me is quite a challenge, and I enjoy that part. My basic message initially is going to be in fact, my age already showing here. The inhumanity of war, and I hope that is my message, because you will be over here some things which I had to go through, and hopefully you take that with you after I conclude. Okay, my childhood, I was born in the Gleiwitz-Breslau area, which was for a while East Germany. My father had been interned, he in fact twice had been inducted into the German army, but they sent him back home again. They didn't have uniforms big enough for him. He was a rather big man. So that was a blessing for him, but then in 1945 there was no more restrictions. Anybody went, small young children as well as older men and everything. It's called the werewolf. That was the last resort. Hitler, although 18 attempts were made to assassinate him, I get evil, continued there. It just wasn't successful. And so the German army leadership, the generals and so were very much against Hitler and tried to obviously stop the war because it was an insanity. My father then was inducted into the army. We didn't know where he was for a while, actually for a long time. And on 2-hour notice, the German authorities came and told my mother to evacuate. We could basically carry what we could on our backs, and that was it. We went further to the south in a town called Magdeburg. There my mother met her sister, who had 6 children, and my mother only had me. I was the second one. We were stationed in a town there in Magdeburg. In the morning there were bombs already hitting the town, and so refugees, people who were being evacuated from the city. There were literally thousands of people, mostly women and children. There were some soldiers who were escorting the people out of town, and anything which was available in terms of trucks and so was being utilized. Unfortunately, and here I'm talking about the inhumanity of war. These refugees and all the people there were then being attacked by fighter planes with machine guns. And I, as a 5-year-old boy, had to see things which now still are in my memory. In fact, I can, at the moment, even now, envision some of the things. That's how long these impressions were. I saw people being shot and horses laying there, and it was a horrendous thing. In fact, when I was 8 years old, I had PSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. At 8 years old, I suddenly started screaming, and so they realized that all these memories were starting to affect me. So that's where, if I may just continue to keep your questions. And I don't remember how things happened. My mother then wound up on the western side in a town called Munster. There were refugees camps set up, and so we spent some time there. I found out when my father then was able to come back. He had been taken prisoner in Poland. The werewolf was in the trenches and had really no ammunition and no guns. The army retreated, and those fellows were sitting in the trenches. They were taken prisoner. My father wound up in a Polish concentration camp. He volunteered as a grave digger and anything to survive, obviously. And then at night, 2 of them with my father, 3 of them, escaped and wanted to go to the western sector or the American sector. They walked over 500 miles, or close to 500 miles, to get to the American sector. They were taken prisoner by the Americans, and this shows already certain pre-conclusions were made. Who was going to get what? Russia had a demarcation line already, which was called the Oder-Neisse line, and since my father had passed that line, the Americans gave him back to the Russians. My father wound up in a Russian concentration camp. He never talked very much about that because he was the only survivor in the cell, the 23 men, and some of the atrocities which happened there, obviously carried on, and he didn't talk very much about it. My father didn't get back until 3 years after the war ended in 1948. And then it was the Red Cross who was able to locate the family and brought us together. And the camp where it was, there were 2,000 people there. And my father was entrepreneurial and an organizer, so he became the camp superintendent. So I'm going to let you ask some questions here at the beginning.
Even though your father never spoke very much about it, how did his imprisonment affect the rest of his life?
Well, I as a 5-year-old boy remember scenes now, and I'm sure that must have affected him too, but I must admit, he never talked to me about it.
How were former German soldiers treated in post-war Germany?
Well, under the NATO agreement, Germany in the early 50s was put a volunteer army together again. And there was such a finally awakening to say that no war should ever happen again. So soldiers who wore their uniforms in the streets were actually attacked by German civilians, and they tore their uniforms off. So that finally was the message, that's the inhumanity of war should stop.
You mentioned in your previous interviews that many Germans did not know about the atrocities that Hitler and his regime were committing. How did the German population receive that information when it fully came to light?
I came to the United, if I may just give you an insight. My father had a senior management position at Heinkel Aircraft in Germany. And William P. Lear Jetson, so came, visited there, and befriended my father and offered him a position to come to the United States. that's how I wound up here. I was 16 years old when I came.
How did, when Hitler's atrocities became known, how did the German population receive them?
I don't think I know that much about that. The only thing is, my mother's brother, in fact, was inducted into the army, into the SS, which turned out, was an elite group, but he was actually drafted into that. He claimed that he never knew anything about that. He would have thought that a man in that position, in that kind of echelon of the services, would have known that, but he swore that he didn't know about that. I had a hard time when I came to the United States because I had such a guilt complex because of what I found out had happened in Germany. In fact, there were times when I said I wasn't German, I was Austrian. It was, it's something, but I tried to do something about it. So during my college days and so on, I got involved with the German embassy in programs to show that there were really two sides to Germany. Show pictures and videos and other things of Germany. The idiocy of war is that the elite, the power corrupts. The people, the upper echelons direct, and the people on the bottom or innocent people are suffering in that way. So, to give you an answer, I don't know how the Germans really acted. I knew how I felt bad about it.
Thank you. What was the state of Germany after World War II had ended, as far as the infrastructure?
Well, Hitler had done something, obviously, one should not forget, and this was the message I had tried to give, that in the late 20s and early 30s, there was such a hyperinflation in Germany. There was such a large number of unemployment. In fact, Germany had 27% unemployment. There were people fighting each other in the streets, the communists versus the National Socialists. And so there was Hitler did the Autobahns, hit a certain infrastructure, and that helped the country really get back on its feet again. There was obviously the Marshall Plan, which was helped by the United States in order to bring Germany back up into the civilized world. And that helped. And so there was, I remember 1948, as soon as my father came back, there were still Reichsmarks, the old German currencies, which were then being exchanged. And they brought a new currency out with the Marshall Plan. That brought the economy back into movement.
Do you have any particular memories of what Germany looked like post-war?
So, obviously, in fact, and I'm sure you probably have seen pictures of it. I mean, Germany was totally devastated. Germany was completely bombed out. And I mean, some of it was, in retribution. You probably heard of Dresden. The city of Dresden had no strategic value at all. And it was firebombed. 143,000 people died in 2 days of infernos there. And so very little was left. Interesting thing is that the dome in Cologne, the cathedral there, the whole city was devastated throughout, and the dome stood there. The same thing happened to the Frauenkirche in Munich. Somehow, I guess, when they bombed it, they avoided it. But it was pretty much endeavor. People were being put to work to clear the streets and clear the rubble.
Earlier you mentioned the Marshall Plan. Did U.S. aid in any way change the attitudes of Germans toward the United States?
Well, and I think the reality is everybody realized it was an unbelievable bad situation. Germany should have never attempted. There was no reason for that. The population in general, once they saw what was happening, realized that this could not go on, and they tried to stop it. So when the Marshall Plan was implemented, it had a major effect, a positive effect, I would think. Especially, like I told you, people were tired of war. tore the uniforms off, and so that was something, and hopefully that's my message, the inhumanity of war. It's just that we can't learn from our history.
Well, we're going to take a little more personal note now. How did you and your family end up in the United States?
As I mentioned before, my father was hired by William P. Lear, and it was kind of ironic. Mr. Lear lived on the West Coast in a town called Pacific Palisades. It was a suburb of Los Angeles. And my father, since he had been offered a senior management position, was required to get a top secret clearance because Lear had a lot of government contracts. That took quite some time, so we stayed with Mr. Lear and his family in his house with tennis courts and swimming pools and electric gates, and overwhelming. So the first 6 months, by the way, that day, the family was Jones, the singer Jones, and they were all close to the movie people, and so as a 16-year-old, I was dragged around by the kids, Lear's kids, and I met quite a few movie stars, so it was quite a start.
That's good. Living the high life. What were your first impressions upon arriving in the United States?
We arrived at Pier 53 in New York. My father had arranged to take a cruise ship, the MS Bremen, and it went over Halifax and got into New York. We were being picked up by my uncle, who was with the hotel operation, a very big car, and it had a sunroof, and I remember, and we drove through Harlem. And my father and I looked at each other and he said, "This can't be America." After all the things we had seen, these were the worst scenes of all, so that was obviously then seeing all those skyscrapers, and so it was quite impressive.
Did you or your family experience any discrimination while in California during the post-war years?
No.
No. Why did you decide to join the United States Army?
I had joined a fraternity, and I got on academic probation.
At UCLA, correct?
Yeah. And my father thought I was getting out of hand, so he kind of helped me, motivated me to go to the Army.
What was your life like in the military?
I was very fortunate. In fact, I was on orders, and I was stationed in Fort Huachuca, Arizona. I don't know if you've next to Tucson, right on the Mexican border. In fact, I was referred to as hell on earth. But I was on orders to Korea, and that was one place I didn't want to go to. So I had some relations with the first sergeant, and I said, "Is there any way I can get out of that?" And he said, "Well, yeah, we can send you to Alaska for a 6-week TDY assignment, and maybe something will change." So great. Went to Alaska and trained women there on switchboards, which was my MOS. And then I came back, and as soon as I got back, maybe 2 weeks later, I was on orders to Germany, which obviously I think I left a dent in the ceiling there. So then I was transferred to Stuttgart, Germany, which was my hometown. That's where I grew up. And I was in the 7th Army headquarters, and they utilized me for my German language experience. First I was assigned to a chaplain, and I translated weddings and baptisms and other things like this, and then they assigned me as a liaison to a German major. That, in fact, my title was liaison officer. In fact, I was taking actually a position because they, well, fortunately for me, but unfortunately for them, didn't have anybody who could speak, and so I got into a position which was quite comfortable.
Do you think being able to speak German affected where you were sent at all?
No, it's stupid to know what the Army does. The Army sends you to Korea instead of Germany.
So they don't do things that make sense.
That's right.
Did you experience any prejudice from U.S. troops while you were in the military?
One has to realize that this was 1958, 57, 8, and so there was still such a memory of the war. In fact, yes, there were some swastikas drawn on my wall lockers, and there was a certain animosity in some places, but not too bad.
What did you do after you left the military in 1962?
I didn't go back to UCLA. I went, as I already mentioned to Dr. Jones, I went to a junior college first, and got my degree there, and then went to El Camino College and got my undergraduate work done. Then I went back to UCLA and got a professional designation in applied information technology. I moved into the computer industry. And then actually went to got my master's in computer science
And what year did you get your master's?
in 1977.
How did you get your job at ARCO, and what exactly did you do?
Just very fortunate. In fact, the reason I got into the data processing field, in fact, my undergraduate efforts were in the business section then, and I had an accounting minor, business major, and I was junior accountant, and then one day this was 1966, and the computer industry was somewhat embryonic yet. In fact, we were still working on card systems, and the first computer I worked on was an IBM 1101, I believe. It had 4K memory, so you can imagine. And so I grew with that.
How did you get involved with the Munich Olympics?
We had visited Europe, and when we came back, I said it would be a really great idea if I could work over there. So I remember one morning, it was a Sunday morning, the Los Angeles Times, which usually was about 300 to 400 pages, and we laid on the floor and looked through all the want ads, and there was an ad there saying that this Computer Science International, Computer Science Corporation needed somebody over there. I was actually a candidate out of 183 men. And it was reduced and reduced. And it was supposed to be 3, and then it turned out it was just me. So I was very fortunate there. And so I was sent to Frankfurt to work for Computer Science International. There were very interesting projects. You would think that was glorious, but you know, I would travel from London to Bern, Switzerland, to Brussels, you know, in Cologne, all in 1 week, you know, and kind of. But it's basically a hotel room and a taxi and offices, you know. So then there was too much travel. We had our first daughter. She was only 7 months old, and I finally said, no, this is not working out for me. I might have to quit. So they said, well, we have an assignment for you, permanent. And that was in Munich. And the system was actually called Golem. Siemens was the contractor for that, and Computer Science International was a subcontractor. So, terrific opportunity for me. In fact, I worked on the communication systems, and I worked with Mark Spitz and Schollander, you know, to test the touch plates, and did all those things for the Olympics, you know, which was great. And then it turned out that for the Olympics, the tickets were lotteried out at the end, and we didn't have any tickets. We got some equestrian and soccer games and other things. So, in fact, there was one thing embarrassing. In fact, Germany was playing the USA, and we were there with our American flags. And then after Germany was ahead 7-0, you know, we were kind of holding our flag down. So then we decided that we would take a vacation, and then we found out, you know, what happened. Munich had done so much to make this one of the most eventful Olympics. Unfortunately, it was then marked.
So you weren't actually in Munich for the kidnapping of the athletes?
No. We had just gone to Spain, and then found out in an elevator that somebody heard us. It must be German. We had heard it.
Do you know at all what the mood in Munich and Germany was like after that?
Oh, when we returned, I mean, we had to go through so many security screens. I mean, there was obviously such an embarrassment, you know, that this could happen there. You know. And everybody was support. I mean, the whole world, obviously, but Germany most of all, because they had tried to make this the best centerpiece ever.
Later in your career, you went to the Soviet Union to work with technology.
Well, you know, part of my assignments were throughout the world. I worked in Milan, Italy, and other. Yeltsin had just come on the rudder, and I think it was an attempt to kind of open the communications between the U.S. and other Western. And so I was sent there on an assignment for 3 months. It was a short trip. It was an air accident reporting system for the Russians, and I was able to fly some of the Russian planes. The TO-154, I remember the seats would fold forward. People had their feet out on the seats. They had mats in the planes instead of where you put your luggage in there. They just had hanging mats and things would fall down and the whole thing. So no wonder they had so many accidents. They had to keep track of it, and that was my system.
What was your time in the Soviet Union like? Did you enjoy it?
Yes, I actually did. And the only thing is I had to get used to the vodka. every luncheon there would be at least a half-a-liter bottle there, which was part of it. I mean, that was just the norm. And it took a while to get used to that. But in Germany they have a saying, it says, intelligence drinks, stupidity eats. So I did get used to that.
Can you elaborate a bit on your statement in your previous interviews that technology was 5 years behind the U.S.?
Well, it was a little bit off the cuff. That particular section, I mean, and it all depended where. I mean, obviously in certain areas, you know, into the aircraft. In fact, I worked for the Cosmonautical Aeronautical Society, and I'm sure they had sections which were equal to our technology. I just happened to work in a section where I felt they were behind. The program, the whole thing was different. So when I said 5 years behind, that's probably a little bit overstated.
What was the mood of the Russian people like during the end of the reign of the Soviet Union?
You're talking about in Berlin, I mean, the wall.
I mean, while you were there.
Oh, yeah, the Yeltsin. I stayed in the Hotel Rossiya, and in fact, this is right on the Red Square. And there was such a tug of war between the factions there. I mean, you know, the Reds. And on Sunday morning, Yeltsin had actually abandoned the government, and we were told to stay in our rooms, or foreigners on the 6th floor, I remember. And there were 10,000 people marching with red flags, and Stalin pictures. You know, there were actually shootings in the lobby of the hotel. So there was a lot of friction there.
Tell us a little bit more about the circumstances that brought you to Texas.
Well, politically again now, in California, a Proposition 13 was passed, and that tripled our real estate taxes, and our daughters were supposed to be bused from, we lived in the Granada Hills area, we were supposed to be bused to Watts, which was the worst area, and we objected to that. We in fact were instrumental in laying in front of buses. We just didn't want them. So the whole turmoil happened there, and since I had international experience, I put my feelers out, and I had several opportunities. One was I had already visas and everything to go to Australia to work for the Department, which is the Social Security Department there. Then I had an opportunity to Riyadh in Saudi Arabia for the Saudi Air Force, and the other one was that my company would transfer me to Texas. And so I decided, well, if Texas doesn't work out, you know, I can have the other opportunity. When Texas worked out.
What did your wife think about the opportunity to go to Saudi Arabia?
That was the reason why we didn't go. It was a very lucrative assignment, and our children would have gone to Swiss schools and whatever. And I mean, it was really, but she did not want to go. She couldn't drive, and she couldn't wear, you know, pants and things like that. So that was the reason why we didn't go.
I certainly can't blame her for that. You mentioned in your previous interviews that you were fortunate enough to travel to China with a group of American businessmen. Can you elaborate a little bit on your experiences there?
In fact, Arco was sold to British Petroleum, and I was supposed to go to LA, and that wasn't really a good choice, so I decided to go on my own and set up my own company. And then suddenly I get an invitation from the State Department to be a member of a delegation going to China, American businessman. And this is the reason why I went to China. We traveled China from Beijing. In fact, my wife still says the trauma of when we arrived in Beijing airport, the doors closed behind us, the big, large glass doors, but they clattered. And she said, "Oh my gosh, what is going to happen to us now?" And we traveled throughout China from Beijing to Longzhou, Chengdu, and it was quite an insight. In fact, we felt that some of the Chinese never had seen a Western face. In fact, we were inland and we looked at factories, and presentation day, they would have big signs that says, "Welcome American delegation." And we would arrive with the bus and they'd all be standing there in Esplanade, and greeting us. So it was, Nixon had done a good job to open things.
In other words, you were treated very well while you were there.
Yes. But only under the supervision of a cadre, who traveled with us and made sure. My wife at one point made the mistake, and my wife is French, by the way, and we met at UCLA at the school, at a class, English for foreign students, and she's a little bit vocal, and she told the cadre, "I think you have to change your system," and boy, that almost cost a major upheaval.
How did you get that opportunity? Was it just luck?
No, I don't know if it was luck. I had a good company, and I think they were looking for people who were successful and represented the U.S. So probably not.
Don't count yourself out. Did you meet anyone of note while you were in China?
Yes. We stayed at the Kunlun Hotel in Beijing, and first of all, I met Henry Kissinger there, and Mr. Rockefeller, and this was the Friendship Week, which was organized at the hotel there. And then Deng Xiaoping was the chairman of China, arrived there, and I never forget, they had the red carpets laid out, and girls with red roses, the whole lineup, walked through there. So it was quite an affair. We didn't meet in person.
I'm going to backtrack a little bit. Earlier in your life, you were placed on the Nike missile range. Can you tell me a little bit about your experience there, how you got to be there?
Well, I had just left the service, and I had left a beautiful girl over there. So I really wanted to go back, and I said, well, and so I wanted to do that in getting a job and be employed. And I got a phone call one day, and it says, we're interested in your resume. Would you please report to an Atlas aircraft company in Oakland, California? And I was excited because I had specified only Germany or France. So I arrived there, and the interviewer said, well, this is going to be on an island in the Pacific. And I stood up and I said, no, that's not going to be for me. And then he said, young man, sit down, let me tell you all the benefits. So he went through it. After 1 year, 10% bonus, and trip anywhere in the world. So I said, oh gosh, for a year I can handle that, make some money, and that's where they started. It was a Nike Zeus missile range, part of the American defense system, a very small island, 2 miles long and 400 yards wide, with 2,000 men on there and 6 women. So the competition was fierce. And but it was quite an experience. They would shoot ICBMs from Vandenberg to the island, and they would be intercepted by, and these were not unannounced, missiles would come, and when the alarm went off, we would put our helmets on, and we would go into the bunkers. At one point, one of the ICBMs actually exploded over the island. That was rather close.
why did you leave the island?
Oh, I had to, why I left, I was, it was kind of interesting, again, I was hired as an accountant, and within a short time, there was such an attrition there, they promoted me to auditor, and before I knew, I was paymaster. And part of my duties were other islands in the chain there. And I went to a neighboring island called Enilavigan, and there was a radar tower, and it was under construction. And I walked over the planks and slipped, and tried to hang on to a rope, but it turned out to be a part of a pulley, and I fell backwards and broke my neck. So that was the end of my tour. Nike Zeus Mislection.
You never got that trip around the world, did
I
you?
never did either, no. In fact, on top of it, this was a job which was as an expatriate, tax exempt. And since I had to come back sooner, then I had to pay Uncle Sam back all the taxes. That was me.
Well, Mr. Goss, I have one final question for you before we go to audience questions. You seem to have led a very successful life. You were in service, you became a successful businessman, you traveled the world. How do you think your life might have been different if your family had stayed in Europe?
In retrospect now, I mean, I obviously lived the American dream. And so in Germany, I enjoy going back, but I couldn't live there anymore. In fact, and I think I mentioned to you that the population density is about 570 people a square mile and 6 in the United States. So I like the world here.
Well, we're certainly glad to have you.
By the way, that's interesting what you're doing. In fact, I was in Chengdu, China, and they had brought in about 700 factory managers and officials, and we were there as a delegation, and they had brought the Chinese, wrote questions down. They had runners who would then translate the Chinese to English, and we would give the answers. There was one embarrassing moment for me. I had to give the introduction speech, and just before I was supposed to go out, there was no podium there. One of my delegation members said to me, "Your zipper is open." And so I went behind the curtain, and it turned out my zipper was broken. And so my speech was on a tabloid here, and so I had to use that to stand there. So, but I did okay because I remembered the things. It was interesting. And the interesting part is that the Chinese at that time, their main topic was how do you motivate people to work? How do you compensate them? I mean, it was nothing about Western things. So,
You make me check my phone.
so now I'm getting questions again on paper.
How did you feel about American involvement during the war on your home front?
In fact, and this is conversations and so with my family, they felt that America was coerced to come into the war. There was a lot of resistance of America to actually get into the war, and it was then political, and so America needed to get into the war. I mean, this kind of policy did not work and should not have.
Did you meet any American soldiers in Germany during your childhood?
Believe it or not, I was a Boy Scout. And my first exposure to Americans was at the World Jamboree in Bad Ischl, Austria. It was 1951. I was 11 years old. And I traveled by bicycle with a group of 7 others to the Jamboree. It was 9,000 Boy Scouts there from all over the world. And the contingent from America was dressed up in Indian costumes. And when there was a grand review in front of the tribunes with the Boy Scouts, they all marched in, you know, different. I never forget that, you know, seeing the American contingent there, of Boy Scouts coming with their Indian headgears.
You mentioned that we fail to learn the lessons of history, one of them being that wars in humanity should be kept fresh in our memories. Are there any just wars?
I wish we would learn from our history. We don't. You know, I don't think there has been a period in our lifetimes where there wasn't a war somewhere. And wars are really perpetrated by people who have the strength and so to do that, but the average populace didn't. I mean, for instance, if I may say so, the word Nazi was really a propaganda tool, no question about it. Germany had two parties, you know, nationalists and the communists. I mean, you know, and it was used to really create animosity, you know, to get people to fight the war. I mean, there's obviously nothing else, you know. So it's a lot of propaganda. You know, people who have the power, you know, who have ultimate power and you know, direct things, and that's what's happening. I think we saw that in the Iraq War, you know, which would have been definitely avoided.
So do you believe that all war is terrible, or is there such a time where war is necessary?
There's never a good war. There's never a good war. And I told you about my childhood and how things suffered. And the German people, yes, Germans in general are very disciplined, and so therefore they followed, you know. I mean, my father was a Nazi. Now that word, you know, shocks everybody, but he was a member of the party. If he didn't, he couldn't have worked where he was, and it was just some of those things, you know, which happened. It's just, no, there's no word ever justified.
Out of the many places you've lived and traveled to, which one was your favorite and why?
We love Thailand. Believe it or not, we have a favorite place, and it seems like there's such an international community there, and we visit friends from all over the world. Maybe from Oslo, Norwegian, or from Vienna, Austria, and we communicated and said we're going to be there, and so they all say we're coming. So I like that.
Why did you join the military, and why did your father prompt you to join the military? If you had seen war's terror firsthand and you almost lost your father to it.
Well, to my father, the uniform represented discipline, and that was, and he thought I needed some discipline. You know, I joined the fraternity, and he thought I was going the wrong way. It wasn't true, you know. That was his perception. So he figured being a soldier would give me a certain moral strength.
What was the most exciting thing you worked on or helped develop during your time with the missile and tech companies?
Olympics, obviously, unequivocally. That was, by the way, if I may mention, so we have a daughter who started at 2.5 years old taking ballet, and when we came to Texas, she was about 6 years old and joined the gymnastics team. And she excelled, and she became state champion 8 times in different categories. It was on the Olympic team, junior Olympic team, to go to Barcelona. We were ready to go, but unfortunately, in the last minute tryout, she fell, and we didn't get to go. Very disappointing.
How does Texas compare to other places you've lived in? Besides the fact that it's better.
That's what I was going to say. There isn't a place better. I really enjoy Texas. Yeah. And I'm still trying to get that Texas accent.
Keep working, I'm sure you'll get eventually. What is the best advice you can give about life?
And that's something which I think about a lot, you know. And I'm very fortunate that I have young daughters who are excelling, and they're achieving their dreams. Too many people are not motivated anymore. In fact, our lifestyles and everything has changed so much that I mean, I come from a disciplined environment, you know, and so everybody is, you know, the German school system, for instance, is a system education by exception. That means at the age of 10 years old, we already put it into a higher echelon, so you know if you qualify. And that doesn't mean you can't enter again, but you know, it creates an elite, you know, which then ultimately, and we have lowered our standards too much.
Is there a particular motto or quote that means a lot to you that you think we could all learn from?
Enjoy life. Enjoy life to the fullest, by all means, but be productive. Try to get the right jobs. Try to do things, you know, to educate yourself and you know, excel.
Well, Mr. Klaus, that's all I have. Thank you for sitting down with us. Appreciate it.
All right, before everyone leaves, we'd like to present Mr. Klaus with something real quick. We'd like to present you with a certificate of appreciation.
Oh, that's so kind.
Thank you for talking with us today, and thank you for your service. And don't forget that we have refreshments right over here. Don't let anyone leave without a cookie, please.